Hi guys, welcome to part 2 on the brain. If you happen to watch this on YouTube at some point in the future, I'm recording this during the COVID-19 pandemic, so we are all stuck in our houses right now. And my family happens to be scattered throughout the house. My husband's a practitioner and he's seeing patients over the phone in my bedroom. My daughter is 9. She's doing her classes online via Skype out in the dining room, so I'm confined to my daughter's bedroom. Hence, you see all of the wonderful stuffed animals all around me. I am hanging out on the ground underneath her loft bed. But this is the only quiet place I could find in my house, so this is where we're going to hang out for the video. We left off at the end of the part 1 lecture talking about the blood supply to the brain and how important it is that the brain has constant blood flow, a constant supply of blood. So blood is really important for the brain. But blood, however, also happens to be a source of danger for the brain. And the reason for this is that the blood can have pathogens in it. Right? It's possible that there are bacteria, viruses, or toxins, even fungus in the bloodstream. And if that's the case, then the blood can actually carry dangerous things into the central nervous system or into the brain. And we don't want that to happen. The brain or the neural tissue is much more delicate than most other organs in the body. So we really have to protect it. We really want to isolate it and keep it away from any possible pathogens that might get into the body. The way that we do this is with something called the blood-brain barrier, or you see we frequently will just say BBB, right, for the blood-brain barrier. That is literally exactly what it sounds like. It is a physical barrier between the blood that flows through general circulation, so the blood that's going to the rest of the body, and the brain, right? A separator, a wall between normal blood and the brain itself, or neural tissue. Again, the point of this is to isolate the central nervous system tissue, so isolate the brain and the spinal cord from the blood that's flowing through the rest of the body. And this just makes it harder for things like bacteria, viruses, and toxins to get into the brain. The blood-brain barrier is formed by tight junctions between the endothelial cells that line the blood vessels in the central nervous system. So let's kind of review what does that actually mean. Endothelial cells are just the cells that line blood vessels. They make up the wall of the blood vessel. So for example, if this is a blood vessel, it has cells that line it, right? That make up this wall. Those are endothelial cells. Most capillaries have tiny little spaces between the cells, and that allows kind of larger things to get in and out of the bloodstream. But in the capillaries, in the small blood vessels that are present in the brain, we have tight junctions between these endothelial cells. So there is no space between these cells. And actually there are little, like little desmosomes or little staples, little connectors that will hold these cells, together. So what that means is that the wall of these capillaries, right, these capillary walls, the blood vessel walls, are very, very solid barriers, right? There's not spaces or gaps. That means that all of the stuff that's flowing through the blood, right, or it's very difficult for things that are flowing through the blood to leave the blood and go out into the central nervous system, right, or out into the brain. Now, this is good if we're talking about something like a bacteria. right? Say there was say there's, streptococcus, whatever, some sort of a bacteria here in the bloodstream. And if this was a blood vessel out anywhere else in the body, this bacteria would be able to squeeze through, leave the blood, and go out and infect this tissue. But when this blood flows through the brain, this bacteria cannot get out most of the time. This is the point, or the idea of the blood-brain barrier, is to stop this bacterium from leaving the blood and getting into the central nervous system. So instead, it would just flow through the blood into the brain and then flow out of the brain without ever infecting the brain tissue itself. That's the point of the blood-brain barrier, to try and stop bad stuff from getting out of the blood and into the central nervous system tissue. Now, that's good. We want to have a nice, strong barrier between the systemic blood and the actual nervous tissue, but it can't be a complete barrier, right? The blood vessels can't be completely impermeable because we do need some stuff to go to the brain, right? We do need to give oxygen to the cells. We do need to give glucose to the cells. So we can't have an impenetrable barrier. There has to be some permeability in these blood vessels. So when we look at the blood vessels, we see how things get in and out of the blood, and that's determined by the chemistry of the actual compound. Is it lipid soluble or not? Is it big or is it small? These things are all going to come into play when we look at if it actually leaves the blood to go into the brain or not. In other words, does it cross the blood-brain barrier or not? So lipid-soluble compounds can diffuse straight through the endothelial cells. These endothelial cells are just like all other cells. Their plasma membrane is made out of a phospholipid bilayer. And remember, when we talk about things getting in and out of cells, if they like lipids, they can go straight through the plasma membrane, right? So lipid-soluble things can easily cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain because they go straight through the endothelial cells. Lipid-soluble compounds, remember, include the respiratory gases. So oxygen and CO2 can easily cross the blood-brain barrier. That makes sense. We want them to, right? That's one of the major reasons we have blood flow to the brain, is to bring oxygen. Water is not lipid soluble, right? It's hydrophilic. It is water. It's polar. So water has to pass through a channel. It can't go straight through the cell. There has to be a channel present, but there are. There are plenty of aquaporins, or channels for water. Same thing with ions. So water and ions have to pass through channels. They can't go directly through the cells. However, there are plenty of channels present. So these can cross the blood-brain barrier perfectly fine. Now, larger water-soluble compounds have to utilize some sort of an active transport mechanism if they're going to get into the brain. So that makes it very difficult for larger things to cross the blood-brain barrier. If there's not an active transporter, an active protein transporter, then these things are not going to cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so larger water-soluble things, this would include stuff like most toxins, like most bacteria. It's very difficult for these to get to cross the blood-brain barrier in most situations. We take advantage of this when we look at medications. So when we design drugs, if the drug is going to have central nervous system effects, if the drug is going to work in the brain, it has to cross the blood-brain barrier. So think about that really quick. If you're designing a drug and you want the medication, the drug, to work in the brain, what type of a compound would you make? Would you make a compound that's hydrophilic, so a polar compound that's hydrophilic? Or would you design a drug that's hydrophobic, a non-polar drug that is hydrophobic or lipid soluble? Okay? Hopefully, as you think about that right now, you're saying that if you want the drug to work in the brain, you would design a drug that is hydrophobic, right? You would design a lipid-soluble drug, because that way it will cross directly through the endothelial cells, it can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it can actually penetrate into the brain. So for example, when we treat meningitis, right? Meningitis is inflammation of the meninges, the lining of the brain. We have to give an antibiotic that crosses into the brain in order to treat that. Okay, so that's really important. When you're picking an antibiotic for meningitis, you have to pick an antibiotic that crosses the blood-brain barrier. If you pick one that does not cross the blood-brain barrier, you're never going to actually treat the meningitis. So the blood-brain barrier is really important to us clinically when we think about giving medications and what medications we're going to give. Now, we said that the blood-brain barrier was formed by tight junctions between the endothelial cells, right? These cells that line the blood vessels in the brain are really closely knit together with tight junctions. Now, why? Right? Why is that? How do those blood vessels know that they need to be different? The answer to that is because of astrocytes. Astrocytes are a specific type of glial cell. Okay, these are neuroglia. Neuroglia are the support cells in the brain. Right? Remember, in the brain, or really in the nervous system, in neural tissue, we have neurons and neuroglia. Neurons are the communicators, the actual main functional cells that send messages back and forth. Neuroglia are the support cells, right? Neuroglia literally means neural glue, so like the glue that holds the nervous system together. Neuroglia support the nervous system and the neurons and help keep them healthy and functioning. Astrocytes are a specific type of neuroglia or glial cell. Astrocytes are the cells that actually maintain and control the blood-brain barrier. Astrocytes have processes that cover the capillaries in the brain. So these astrocytes have a bunch of processes, and these processes end up covering and wrapping around the blood vessels in the brain. And the astrocytes release chemicals that then come down to these endothelial cells and control them. They tell the endothelial cells to form these tight junctions. Okay, so it's astrocytes that are responsible for creating and maintaining the blood-brain barrier. Without astrocytes, the blood-brain barrier would not be there. It would not work, and the blood vessels would be too permeable. So they would start letting too much into the neural tissue or into the central nervous system. So there are multiple points of entry or multiple places where pathogens could enter into the central nervous system. The first place we just looked at, so the normal blood flow that's going to the brain, right? The blood that flows through the blood vessels in the brain, delivering blood to the brain. That's one place where pathogens could enter into the brain. So that's where we have the blood-brain barrier. Another point of entry, another place where pathogens could enter into the brain are at the choroid plexus, where we make cerebrospinal fluid or CSF. In the ventricles of the brain, right, those open areas in the center of the brain, there are little masses of capillaries that we refer to as the choroid plexus. And this choroid plexus is where we make cerebrospinal fluid. Right? So the blood flows through these capillaries, and fluid gets pushed out of these capillaries into the ventricles of the brain, the big spaces in the brain. And that fluid that gets pushed out of the blood becomes cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. Well, that cerebrospinal fluid, that CSF, is going to end up floating, bathing the whole brain, really. It flows through all the ventricles inside the brain and the central canal in the center of the spinal cord, and then it also flows all around the outside of the brain. So this cerebrospinal fluid has to be clean, right? If bacteria or pathogens enter into the cerebrospinal fluid, then they're going to make the brain sick. They're also going to infect the brain and the spinal cord itself. So we have to make sure that pathogens don't enter the central nervous system in the cerebrospinal fluid. So the second point is protected by what we call the blood-CSF barrier, right? So the blood-brain barrier was the barrier in the normal capillaries that just go all throughout the brain. And now we have the blood-CSF barrier, which is present on the choroid plexus. The blood-CSF barrier is formed and maintained, controlled by ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are another type of glial cell, right? Another type of support cell. Ependymal cells, remember, are cells that are responsible for creating cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. They also, as they surround these capillaries, as they create the CSF, they also create this blood-CSF barrier. So what the ependymal cells do is the ependymal cells completely surround the capillaries of the choroid plexus, like these little masses of capillaries in the ventricles of the brain. And the ependymal cells have tight junctions formed between them. So the ependymal cells completely surround the capillaries and they form these tight junctions around them. So there's a very tight-knit barrier surrounding the choroid plexus, surrounding these capillaries. Very similar to the blood-brain barrier, right? The blood-brain barrier also has tight junctions so that there aren't big spaces, there aren't big gaps. And the only stuff that can leave the blood in these vessels of the choroid plexus are things that are either really small or are lipophilic. So it makes it harder for pathogens like bacteria to leave the blood and go into the cerebrospinal fluid. The blood-brain barrier is really important. It helps to protect the central nervous system, the neural tissue, and it helps to limit the number of pathogens that actually get into the central nervous system. But the blood-brain barrier is not complete. There are a few points where the blood-brain barrier breaks, where the blood-brain barrier is not present, because in these specific areas, we have to have more permeability for the actual functioning of the nervous system itself. So the breaks in the blood-brain barrier, or by break, I don't mean broken. It's not like the brain is broken. It's that we intentionally do not have a blood-brain barrier present in these areas. The first one down here, there's not a blood-brain barrier in the vessels of the choroid plexus. That's just because there's a blood-CSF barrier. So in the choroid plexus, it's not a blood-brain barrier where we have astrocytes inducing tight junctions. Instead, it's the blood-CSF barrier where we have ependymal cells maintaining the barrier. So there's still protection here at the choroid plexus. There's still a barrier. It's just not technically the blood-brain barrier. It's the blood-CSF barrier. These other three areas here, however, there is no intense barrier. So these first three areas are areas where there's a break in the blood-brain barrier, and these are potential spots where we could have pathogen entry into the CNS. So the first one, portions of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, in lab, you guys saw where the hypothalamus was in the brain, but the hypothalamus is a really specialized, really important part of the brain. And one of its jobs is to control the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus secretes hypothalamic hormones, right? Just hormones from the hypothalamus. And these hormones control the pituitary gland. We'll talk about the endocrine system in A&P2, but for right now, just know that these glands secrete hormones, and the hormones travel through the bloodstream, and they go to a target organ, and they make something happen. So the key here is that hormones travel through the bloodstream. So the hypothalamus produces and releases these hormones, and they have to enter into the blood to travel wherever they need to go. In this case, they have to travel to the pituitary gland. So they have to enter the blood. If the blood vessels here in the hypothalamus had tight junctions and had really reduced permeability, then the hormones couldn't enter into the bloodstream. They're big proteins or big polypeptides. So we can't have a blood-brain barrier. We can't have this restricted permeability in the hypothalamus, or the hormones would never get to enter into the bloodstream. So the blood vessels in the hypothalamus have a lot of permeability. They're really permeable. This is good because the hormones can enter into the blood and they can go work, and we need that to happen. It also happens to be a little dangerous because pathogens could also squeeze through these blood vessels. So if a bacterium is going to get into the central nervous system and cause infection, this might be one point where it can do that. Also at the pituitary gland itself. The pituitary gland is an endocrine gland. It secretes pituitary hormones. These hormones, again, have to enter into the blood in order to work. So we can't have the blood-brain barrier here in the capillaries in the pituitary gland. Instead, we have more permeable capillaries present in the pituitary gland so that the hormones can enter into the bloodstream. Same thing with the pineal gland. The pineal gland, remember, is at the posterior portions of the brain. And the pineal gland is another endocrine gland. It secretes hormones. Hormones have to enter the bloodstream. So these are 3 points: the blood vessels and parts of the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland are unprotected points where pathogens might possibly be able to enter into the brain. This is why it is possible to have infections present in the brain. It's rare, it's harder for this to happen, but it is possible because of these 3 possible points of entry. Okay, real quick, just a kind of overview, a review of the protection and support of the central nervous system, or the brain. One, we have meninges. Remember that meninges are the membranes that surround and protect the brain and spinal cord. Cranial meninges surround and protect the brain. Spinal meninges surround and protect the spinal cord. Spinal meninges we'll look at in lab. The cranial meninges are what we really focused on here in lecture. There are multiple layers to the meninges. The dura matter is the outer layer, really strong, tough layer. Then the middle layer is the arachnoid matter, and then the layer right on the surface of the brain is the pia matter. That's a more delicate layer. These meninges, remember, help to stabilize the brain in the cranial cavity, and they help keep the brain centered in the cranial cavity inside the skull or the cranium, so that the brain doesn't bounce around and bounce into the skull itself. So I describe them kind of like as a seatbelt, right? They help to seatbelt the brain and hold the brain in the skull. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, has numerous functions. One, it helps to, it's constantly circulating, right? It's this sterile fluid that circulates and bathes the brain and spinal cord. It's constantly washing the brain and spinal cord. And as it does that, it helps to bring nutrients to the brain and remove wastes. It keeps things flowing all the time so that there's never a buildup of wastes or toxins or ions in any one area of the brain. Everything is constantly flowing. It also provides cushioning. It reduces shock. So, if you bang your head or you jerk it really quickly, there's some shock absorption because of the fluid that surrounds the brain. It also provides buoyancy to the brain so that the brain doesn't sit really heavy on its base. You don't want the brain to be resting on the skull, because then you would squish the brainstem. Instead, the brain kind of floats in this cerebrospinal fluid, and that reduces the feels like weight of the brain, so it's not very heavy. If you think about when you pick someone up in water, right? If I were to pick you up on land, you would feel kind of heavy. But if I pick you up in the pool, then you feel really light because you're more buoyant in the pool. That's kind of like what the cerebrospinal fluid does for the brain. The brain just kind of really easily, it's really perfectly buoyant in the skull because of the cerebrospinal fluid. Finally, we have the blood-brain barrier and the blood-CSF barrier. And this selectively isolates the brain, the neural tissue, from other chemicals and pathogens that flow through the blood that goes through the rest of the body. This helps to keep pathogens and toxins out of the neural tissue, as well as some other toxins like medications, for example. Sometimes we give a medication that we want to work out in the body somewhere else, and it might be toxic for the brain. So in that case, we can create a medication that does not cross the blood-brain barrier. And that way we allow it to have effects out in the body without actually hurting the brain. For example, loperamide, Imodium AD, is an anti-diarrheal medication. It happens to be an opiate, like a pain reliever, a painkiller. Those are addictive, right? They have a lot of central nervous system effects. However, if we take the medication and we make it really big and hydrophilic, it does not cross the blood-brain barrier. Now we can give it as an over-the-counter medication. It works in the GI tract to stop diarrhea, but it does not have any of the other effects because it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. Right? So the blood-brain barrier really helps to protect the brain, and we can take advantage of that scientifically when we're creating medications, which is pretty cool. These next couple slides, I'm not going to go over them with you right now. They're just kind of good reference points for you. They are showing you the diencephalon and then the brainstem. And as we talk through the next like big chunk, the next section of this lecture, we're going to be talking about the diencephalon and the brainstem, and we're going to be referring to a lot of these areas. These are just here for you to flip back to if you're not sure, you can't quite picture where something is. These are really good reference points for you. So just really quickly, the diencephalon is this area up here that includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Underneath that, you get to the brainstem. So the true actual brainstem includes these three areas. The midbrain, right? This is the midbrain right here. At the back of the midbrain, you have two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi. So like right here and then underneath the inferior colliculi. We'll talk about both of those. Underneath that, you have the pons. The pons kind of bulges out right here in the front. And then we have these peduncles, or these little connections that connect back to the cerebellum back here. So the cerebellum is this kind of large section that would be back here behind the pons. And the cerebrum, the main big part of the brain, goes all up here. It would be all on top of all of this. So there's this huge area that kind of goes on top of the diencephalon. So you have the diencephalon with the thalamus and hypothalamus. Then you have the midbrain and the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. So the very bottom part of the brain, the very last inferior part of the brainstem, is the medulla oblongata. This is where we have like the most basic life-sustaining functions that all living things have. all down in the medulla oblongata, like controlling your breathing and your heart and just being conscious. All of that stuff is like brain stem stuff. The medulla oblongata, then you see, connects to the spinal cord, right, which would go all the way down your spine. You can also see the cranial nerves on here. I remember we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Do they have cranial nerve 1 on here? No. You can see starting with 2, so cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, and then so you can see the 2 optic nerves coming in and where they meet, the optic chiasm, where they meet and then they cross over and wrap around. You see cranial nerve 3, 4, 5, a big one here. This is the trigeminal nerve because there's actually like 3 huge branches. You see 6 and 7. Oops. 6, 7, and 8. And then you go down 9 to 10, 11, and 12. So like 11 and then 12 comes in. And then you see the spinal nerves. Once you move down to the spine, those are actually spinal nerves. That's lab stuff though. Here again, just showing you the same thing. This is from the front. So up top again, we have the diencephalon. So up here where the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus are, that's the diencephalon. So not technically the brainstem yet. This is kind of cool because it shows you the right and left side of the thalamus. So when you see the thalamus, again, you see like the 2 big chunks on either side, and then you can see where it comes together in the center here. Let's see. Also, if you go down just a little bit from that, like just looking underneath that a little bit, the infundibulum right here, that's just the very beginning of the stalk that's going to end up hanging down and connecting to the pituitary gland. And then right underneath that, you see the mammillary body. The mammillary body, there's 2 of these, right? Think like 2 breasts, mammary. That's why they are called that. They look like 2 breasts. But you see the mammillary body right underneath that. Again, you can see the optic chiasm as well. So cranial nerve 2, these are the optic nerves from the eyes. So like this one will come from one of your eyes, this one from the other eyes, and from the other eye. As the nerves come in, they come right here to the optic chiasm. That's like where they merge and cross. And then the nerves from this side cross over there. The nerves from this side would cross over there. Again, this view is just kind of nice for you to see the cranial nerves. You can see the way they kind of, like the way they go out. So like 6, 7, 8, and then you go down 9, 10, 11, and then 12 in the center. Okay, so finally, this is the view from behind. I guess I lied. I wasn't going to talk about these, but they are kind of helpful to go through quickly. So this is looking at the diencephalon and brainstem from behind. So again, we take off the cerebrum, we take off the cerebellum on the back, and we're looking at what's kind of inside the brain, deep inside the brain. You see the thalamus, right? The right and left thalamus here. At the very back of that, you can see where the pineal gland is, right? So the pituitary gland hangs down underneath the brain, like in the front, and the pineal gland is in the back. So pituitary is in the front, pineal is in the back. You can also see the choroid plexus. Remember, the choroid plexus are just the masses of capillaries that are present in the ventricles of the brain. So right on top of the thalamus, you have the lateral ventricles. There's the big lateral ventricles here. Down here, this is where the 4th ventricle is. These capillaries, that's where we filter fluid out of the blood and we produce the cerebrospinal fluid. So you can kind of see like where those vessels of the choroid plexus are. Also, the corpora quadrigemina, this includes both of the superior colliculi and both of the inferior colliculi. So when you look at this all together, look, there are 2 superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi. Put them all together and look, there's 4, hence quad. Right, quadragemina, right, corpora like body. So the body of 4. Let's see, what else? I think that's it. That's good on this one. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and make our way through each of the different parts of the brain. So we'll start with the diencephalon, and then we're going to work our way down the brainstem, and then in part 3, we'll go ahead and work through all of the different parts of the cerebrum. The diencephalon is located in the very center of the brain, underneath the cerebrum. So if you look at this top picture right here, all of this is the cerebrum, right? The big main mass of the brain is the cerebrum. Back here in blue, that's the cerebellum. Those are the 2 biggest parts. If you pull that off, you can see the diencephalon in the brainstem. That's what we were just looking at in those last pictures. So the diencephalon is this kind of circular area that you see in there, the red kind of circular area in the very center, deep part of the brain. The diencephalon acts as a link between the cerebrum and the rest of the brainstem, right? So it structurally and functionally connects the brainstem with the rest of the cerebrum, right? So like this is the rest, this is the brainstem here. And then up here, we said all of this is the cerebrum. You can see how the diencephalon connects the 2, right? So things that messages that come up the brainstem are going to go to the diencephalon and then out to the brain, right? Or things from the brain are going to go to the diencephalon and then down the brainstem. Okay, so it connects the cerebrum with the rest of the brainstem. The diencephalon is divided into 3 parts. The epithalamus, we're not going to focus on that much, but the 3 divisions include the thalamus, which there's technically a right thalamus and left thalamus, which you guys saw in all those pictures, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The epithalamus is where the pineal gland is in the back of the brain. I remember when we looked at the back, we saw the little pineal gland that pokes out like right back here. So the thalamus, again, there's the right and left thalamus. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus, right? Hypo means below. So like the area right underneath the thalamus, like right here, is the hypothalamus. Remember that the hypothalamus is the area where the pituitary gland is connected. So the pituitary gland hangs just below the hypothalamus. Remember that the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum, right? The infundibulum is the stalk that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. So we'll talk about each of these in more detail. So we'll talk about each part of the diencephalon in more detail, starting with the thalamus. The thalamus is a relay and processing center for sensory information that's coming into the cerebrum. All of this, or most of the sensory information that's coming in, so things that we're seeing, things that we're feeling, we're touching, that sensory information comes in to the thalamus, and then the thalamus relays it to the appropriate part of the cerebrum for us to then be aware of the sensory information. So if a signal regarding hearing is coming in from the ears are going to send that signal to the thalamus first, and then the thalamus will relay it out to the hearing center in the cerebrum. The neurons in the thalamus are constantly receiving tons and tons of sensory information. And they're what we call, or the thalamus is what we call a gatekeeper for that sensory information. It receives millions and millions of signals all the time, and it only sends a very small portion of that information to the cerebrum. Now, when we talk about sensory information, again, like vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch, you're not consciously aware of that sensory information until it gets out here to your cerebrum. The thalamus is incredibly important because it doesn't send all signals to the cerebrum, which means we're not aware of all signals. We don't actually notice everything that we sense, which is important. So again, the thalamus is constantly receiving millions and millions of sensory signals. The thalamus decides which of those sensory signals are the most important, and it only sends the most important things to the cerebrum for you to be aware of. This prevents the cerebrum from being overwhelmed by unnecessary information. Like right now, for example, there's so much sensory information that I could be focusing on, right? I'm seeing so much stuff around me, all the stuff in my daughter's room, all the colors, the light, the shadows. I can hear my daughter's class going in the other room. I can hear her wiggling at the table. I can hear my husband calling patients in that room. I can hear the rustling of the trees outside. Like I can feel this rug underneath me. There are a million different sensory things happening right now. They are not all important. If I was focusing on all of those, I couldn't be focusing on what I need to. I couldn't be concentrating on what I'm about to say next because my brain would be so overwhelmed with all of that sensory information. So the thalamus takes in sensory information and it gets rid of most of it. Most of the signals just stop right there at the thalamus and you never become aware of them. Only very, very few of the signals, the biggest, the most important signals, get sent out to your cerebrum for you to become aware of them. And that allows you to focus on what's important. We think that there might be a problem with this gatekeeper function or this relay function of the thalamus in things like diseases like autism, for example. Patients who have autism are very sensitive to certain sensory information, right? So like a crowded room where there's a lot of different people talking is just incredibly overwhelming for some patients with autism. And imagine like somebody without autism can be okay because their brain knows how to process that information and that not all of those signals need to be paid attention to all the time. But in a patient whose thalamus can't do that, all of a sudden the brain is just going crazy with tons and tons of stimuli, every little noise, every movement of every person, every squeak of every shoe, everything becomes this overwhelming signal in the brain, and it's just impossible to function like that. So the thalamus is really important because of this gatekeeper function. The thalamus is also part of what's called the limbic system. We're going to focus on the limbic system more in part 3 of the lecture, but the limbic system is essentially what we would call your emotional brain. It includes numerous different structures in the brain, but it's all involved in emotion, how we experience our emotions, how we express our emotions, and then also memory. The thalamus, mostly when it comes to the limbic system, the function of the thalamus is one, to allow us to be aware of our emotions. So it allows us to become aware of our emotions, and it allows us to access our memories. Again, we'll talk more about memory and emotion in the limbic system in part 3. All right, so the diencephalon, we said, includes the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. The hypothalamus sits right underneath the thalamus, hence the name hypothalamus, right? Hypo means below, so the name is literally telling us below the thalamus. If you look down here at the picture, the thalamus is shown in red, and then the hypothalamus is underneath it in green. So kind of roughly triangle-shaped area underneath the thalamus. The hypothalamus is the major control center for the endocrine system. The endocrine system includes all of the body's hormone-producing glands, and then the hypothalamus is also involved in the body's autonomic nervous system. Right? So it controls the endocrine system and hormones, as well as the autonomic nervous system, which, remember, the autonomic nervous system includes the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The way that the hypothalamus does this, or its specific functions, includes that it controls hormone production and release from the pituitary gland. So you'll notice that the pituitary gland hangs just underneath the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will release hormones. Those hormones will travel down to the pituitary gland and control the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus directly controls hormone release from the pituitary gland. The hormones from the pituitary gland then go on and control things all over the body. We refer to it as the master gland because it controls so many other glands in the body. So the hypothalamus, because it controls this master gland, is really important in the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is also important for what we call thermoregulation. Right? Think thermo like thermometer, thermostat, right? That makes you think temperature. So temperature regulation. The hypothalamus literally controls the temperature of your body. We refer to the hypothalamus as the hypothalamic thermostat. What the hypothalamus does is it sets the temperature for the body. So whatever temperature the hypothalamus says you should be, the body will be. The body will work to get to that temperature. So, for example, if the hypothalamus says that you should be 98.6 degrees, that's the temperature that the body's going to be. Say you're 98.6 degrees, and then the hypothalamus changes its mind, and the hypothalamus changes the thermostat, right? It moves the number up on the thermostat, and the hypothalamus now says you should be 102 degrees. That's your new goal. That's what the body is going to work to get to. It does whatever the hypothalamus says. So if the hypothalamus says you should be 102 degrees, you're going to want to warm up to that. So what the body is going to do is the body is going to shiver to generate heat. And you'll generate enough heat to increase your temperature to 102 degrees. And then the body will stop and the body's happy. The body will do whatever it has to get to the temperature that the hypothalamus says you should be. That's what happens in a fever. Right? When you have a fever, the hypothalamus increases the temperature set point, the temperature that the body wants to be. And then you shiver to warm up to that point. And once you get to the new set point, then you stop and you're fine. Also cooling down, right? So say you did this, you got up to 102 degrees, and then the hypothalamus changes its mind again. And now the hypothalamus says, nope, I don't want you to be 102, I want you to be 97 degrees. Then the body says, well, I'm too hot, I need to cool off, and you sweat in order to decrease your temperature to the new set point of 97, right? So the hypothalamus controls hormone production in the pituitary. It also sets the temperature for the whole body, right? It's the thermostat for the body. The hypothalamus is also has numerous autonomic functions. So the autonomic nervous system, remember, think of it like the automatic nervous system. These are things you don't consciously control in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So heart rate, for example, the hypothalamus can adjust heart rate via the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. It can also, so HR is heart rate. It can also adjust blood pressure. It can adjust GI secretions and digestion. The hypothalamus is also involved with emotion and long-term memory. It's involved in numerous different, or a variety of different emotional responses. These include things like anger and fear, aggression, pleasure, sex drive, numerous different emotional responses. It also acts as the link between the thalamus and the rest of the limbic system, or emotional brain. The hypothalamus is incredibly important in forming long-term memories, right? So it's necessary for the formation of long-term memories. Finally, the hypothalamus is involved in some of our kind of basic drives that we need to maintain life. So generating feelings of thirst or hunger, as well as satiety, or this is just fullness. And again, these are basic things that all animals need. You need to feel hungry when you need nutrients, right? Otherwise, you don't know when to eat. You need to feel thirsty when you need water. All of this is important for life. We mentioned the pituitary gland before, but the pituitary gland is a major endocrine gland, right? The master gland that is connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum. So if you look over here at the picture, you see the hypothalamus, right, is in green, and hanging underneath it, you see the pituitary gland. Just the little narrow stalk right here that connects the pituitary to the hypothalamus is referred to as the infundibulum. The infundibulum is important because it has, it carries blood vessels, important blood vessels that cross from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus, right, again, which is part of the diencephalon, the hypothalamus controls the secretion of hormones from the pituitary gland. So that means that the hypothalamus is this important interface or important connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Because technically the hypothalamus is part of the nervous system and the pituitary gland is part of the endocrine system. So this point where they come together and communicate with each other is a really important connection between the two systems. We refer to this as the hypothalamic pituitary axis. All right, so we're going to move down from the diencephalon to the brainstem. The very top part of the brainstem is referred to as the midbrain. So if you look at the picture down here, remember the diencephalon, where the thalamus and hypothalamus are, is the area where this kind of like red circle at the top is. Now we're moving down to the midbrain, and the midbrain is this kind of green area right here. The midbrain has various visual and auditory functions. So visual, obviously vision, seeing, and auditory refers to hearing functions. The midbrain controls multiple visual processes, including blinking, right? Blinking is not something that you think about doing. You constantly blink, right, to distribute tears across your eyes and keep them moist. The midbrain is also important for controlling our visual tracking ability. What visual tracking is the ability to follow a moving object with your eyes. So, for example, when you go to the doctor and he holds his finger up, or she holds her finger up and she says, okay, follow my finger, and moves it back and forth, up and down, and they say, okay, can you do this or not, right? Are your eyes able to smoothly track this object? That's a test that's checking the midbrain. Also, pupil dilation and constriction in changing light. Your pupil is the black circle in the center of your eye. The pupil, the size of the pupil determines how much light you let go into your eye back to where your nerves are. So when you're in a really, really bright room, your pupils get really small, right? Because there's so much light coming in. But then when you go into a really dark room, your pupils get big, right? The black area dilates, it gets larger because there's not very much light around you. So you need to open up that pupil to allow as much light in as possible. This is an important reflex, right? Checking whether or not your pupils constrict, right? Get smaller and dilate or get bigger like they're supposed to. When you go to the doctor, they check this, right? They do a neurological test to check this. That's when they shine the little pen light in your eye, right? So they shine the light in your eye, and when they shine the light in your eye, they expect your pupils to get smaller. So when there's light, the pupil constricts. And when there's no light, then when they take the light away, the pupil should dilate or get bigger. When the doctor does that, they're checking the function of part of your midbrain. The midbrain also the midbrain also relays sounds from the inner ear to the thalamus. So when they do the pupil dilation, they're checking for parts of your midbrain and cranial nerves. So the nerves that carry the signal to the pupillary muscles. Sorry, I just wanted to add that in there. Both the signals in and the signals out are being checked. All right, so the midbrain also relays sounds from the inner ear to the thalamus, up at the top, right above the midbrain. So the midbrain is involved in multiple visual and auditory functions, processing these signals, and it also directs some reflexes that are associated with both vision and hearing. So the reflexes that go along with what you see and what you hear. We'll talk about a couple examples of this. I'm not going to write down the example because it's really long, but make sure you understand what we're saying here. So reflexes associated with vision and hearing. Right now you're sitting looking at the computer, right? And you're watching this lecture. You're concentrating really well on this lecture. All of a sudden, stay at whatever, the wall, window, door, whatever's next to you, you hear really hard. What are you going to do? Are you going to just sit here calmly and keep watching the lecture? No, right? Your reflex, without even thinking about it, instantly you're going to look, right? You're going to look towards wherever that noise was. That is a safety mechanism, right? Evolution has designed these reflexes. So when you hear a loud noise or even a quiet noise, when you hear something alarming, you automatically look at it without even thinking. This happens because of the midbrain. Now, if this was something that you consciously decided to do up here in your cerebrum, it would take longer, because you would have to think about it. You would come up with the plan on what muscles you're going to use, and you'd send that plan down. You would go to your cerebellum and to your brainstem, and then you'd send the signals out, and there would be a bunch of different synapses or connections, and it would take longer. But since this is a reflex. You're not consciously deciding to do it. It's just a reflex. You get rid of all of these extra synapses, these extra connections, and the signal simply, you hear it and then it goes out. That's it. It's really fast. Okay, so that's evolutionary, that's protective. So the midbrain controls auditory reflexes, like we just talked about, and then also visual reflexes. So same situation. Say you're sitting here and you're watching this lecture, right? You're looking at the screen, and then all of a sudden you kind of like halfway see or notice something flashing by your peripheral vision. You're going to look at it, right? Like you're going to look at what it is. Or if in your peripheral vision you see it coming at you, you're going to move, right? There are automatic responses to things that you see. Or if you're sitting here and all of a sudden you see something flying at your head, are you going to just sit there and let it do? No, of course not. You're going to duck, or you're going to reach up to grab it. And that is an automatic response that is controlled based on centers in your midbrain. Okay, also in the midbrain, there is a really specialized structure that's called the substantia nigra. The reason it's called the substantia nigra, nigra as in dark, that's referring to the fact that it's really dark in color. It happens to have a lot of melanin in it, a lot of neuromelanin, and melanin is dark in color, right? Just like in the rest of our body, melanin is dark in color. So there's this like motor center, this area that happens to be really dark in color. That's the substantia nigra. So this is a motor center, as in it's related to or involved in motor signals or movement. What the substantia nigra does is it sends inhibitory centers or inhibitory signals up to the thalamus, and that inhibits motor signals that are coming down. So for example, say, up here in your motor center, you're sending a signal down to say, I want this to contract. Well, that signal is going to come down and it's going to get relayed through the thalamus. There are a lot of signals that come out, and sometimes there are too many, right? The body's got too many ideas, too many things it's saying to do. Well, the substantia nigra will inhibit some of those, right? It sends these little negative signals up that say, no, like that's a little too much. And that helps to inhibit unwanted contractions, limits the number of stimulatory signals that are going out to the muscles to help limit unwanted contractions. Finally, the midbrain is important or involved in maintaining consciousness. Consciousness is just defined as an awareness of ourselves and the environment. So when someone's unconscious, they have no awareness of themselves, right? They're not aware of what they're feeling, seeing, sensing, and no awareness of the environment around them. So the midbrain, again, is one of the areas that's important in maintaining awareness or consciousness. Okay, now we'll move down to the pons. We did the Diencephalon up here, and then we did the midbrain. Now the pons. The pons is this kind of like swollen little belly that sticks out. That's just anterior or just in front of the cerebellum. The pons connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. The cerebellum, remember, is this large segment back here. It's at the back bottom part of the brain. The pons has numerous tracts that reach back and wrap back around and connect to the cerebellum. The pons carries or relays numerous motor and sensory signals up and down the brainstem. So as sensory signals come in, they go through the pons and get sent up. And as motor signals go out, they go through the pons and get sent either back to the cerebellum or down the brainstem. The pons is involved in a wide variety of different things. It's involved in numerous sensory processes like hearing and equilibrium, taste, facial sensations like pain, as well as touch. It controls numerous motor functions, including eye movement, chewing and swallowing, as well as facial expressions and posture. It also has visceral functions in that it controls saliva secretions and tear secretions. And then it's also involved in normal kind of life processes, including sleep and respiration. Since the pons has so many kind of various wide range functions, we're going to talk through them in more detail. The pons has numerous nuclei present in it. A nucleus is just a mass of neuron cell bodies. So we'll see that in different parts of the pons there are different nuclei. So there'll be like one little mass of neuron cell bodies, and all of those neurons are similar. They all have a similar function. Say all of those neurons go to the respiratory muscles, right? So that nucleus is involved in respiration. And then, in a different part of the pons, there'll be another nucleus. That's just another mass of neurons that all control the same thing. So in the pons, there are both sensory nuclei and motor nuclei. There are sensory and motor nuclei that are related to or that control the cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. These cranial nerves innervate the muscles of the jaw, the eye, and the face, as well as the organs of the inner ear. Right, so let's repeat that. The pons, right, which is part of the brainstem, has little motor or has little nuclei, little masses of neuron cell bodies, and those neurons have axons that become the cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. So those cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 they originate in the pons. And again, those cranial nerves end up controlling the muscles of the jaw. That's why we said that the pons is important in that it controls chewing. It also controls the muscles of the eye, which is why we said it controls eye movement. And it controls the muscles of the face, which is why we said that it's important in determining facial expressions, right? Smile, scowl, surprise, etc. Okay, the neurons that control the muscles of the face, they all start in the pons. Also, the neurons that are involved or that go to the inner ear originate in the pons, and here in the inner ear is where we have balance or equilibrium, right? So we said the pons is important in equilibrium because the neurons that go to the inner ear are here. Okay. The pons also has nuclei or little masses of neurons that are involved with respiration. So the pons is important in respiration. The pons has the apneustic center and the pneumotaxic center. Both of these, both the apneustic center and the pneumotaxic center, send signals to modify the respiratory rhythmicity center. Let's talk about what that means. First, the respiratory rhythmicity center That is not in the pons. That's actually in the medulla, right? In the medulla oblongata, which is lower in the brainstem. So the pons has the apneustic center and the pneumotaxic center. Okay, the respiratory rhythmicity center is in the medulla oblongata. Now, the respiratory rhythmicity center in the medulla, that actually sets the respiratory rate. So the medulla oblongata at the very bottom of the brainstem, it sets the basic respiratory rate. So how fast you breathe. Every time you inhale, that's because of the medulla oblongata. Now, the pons, right, these two centers that are in the pons, they modify that basic respiratory rate. Okay, so they modify respirations. If you are going to go exercise and you need to start breathing faster, the pons is going to do that. Or if you don't have enough oxygen and you need to start taking really deep breaths, the pons is going to do that, right? It alters your respirations, whether you need to breathe faster or slower or deeper or shallower, whatever. The pons does that alteration. The medulla oblongata, right, the respiratory rhythmicity center in the medulla, does your basic respirations, right, your basic rate. It sends the signal every time you inhale. Finally, there are other nuclei in the pons that relay information to and from the cerebellum. Remember, we said that the pons connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. So information that needs to get sent into the cerebellum or from the cerebellum is going to go through the pons. So the pons has nuclei that are important connection to the cerebellum. Here you can see the pons, right? And then the little tracts that connect back to the cerebellum, which would be right back here, which you can see over here, right? Here's the cerebellum. This in blue is the pons. In the pons, you see the respiratory centers, right? So that's what these kind of like dark little balls are showing you. These are the masses of neurons that are involved in respiration. You can see the reticular formation. It doesn't show you all of the nuclei that are present. These lines, these tracts, these are just showing you fibers that are carrying signals either up the brainstem or down the brainstem. You see this red one going back to the cerebellum, etc. All right, so we're moving down the brainstem, and finally we get to the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is at the very bottom of the brainstem. And it connects the brain to the spinal cord. So if you look at the picture over here, again, the Diencephalon was up top, and then we had the midbrain, and then in blue was the pons, and now finally the medulla oblongata. And then that would connect to the brainstem would be underneath. The medulla oblongata relays tons of information. All the information coming up from the spinal cord has to go through the medulla oblongata. And then the opposite's true. All the control signals that are going out have to go through the medulla oblongata. So it relays tons of information from the spinal cord to different parts of the brain. The medulla oblongata is not just a relay center, though. It has very important life-sustaining functions, autonomic functions that are necessary for life. Again, autonomic, think of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And I always say autonomic, like automatic. These are automatic things that happen in your body to keep you alive, things you don't have to think about, things that are necessary for all mammals, right? All mammals need their heart to beat. All mammals need to breathe. All mammals have to have, sufficient blood pressure, etc. All animals have to digest their food. So these autonomic functions, a lot of them are controlled by the medulla oblongata at the base of the brainstem. So autonomic functions, autonomic functions that are controlled by the medulla include heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, and respiration. The centers, right, the little nuclei that are present in the medulla oblongata include the cardiac center. The cardiac center has neurons that go to the heart and adjust heart rate. So if I go work out and my heart needs to beat faster, then that means the medulla oblongata would control that. The cardiac centers in the medulla oblongata would send a signal down to my heart and tell it to beat faster. The vasomotor center controls blood vessels, which controls our blood pressure. Okay, so if I need my blood pressure to go up, the vasomotor center is going to do that. So the medulla oblongata is involved in controlling my blood pressure. There are centers that control digestion, and then also the respiratory center, specifically the respiratory rhythmicity center, is involved in controlling respiration. So every single breath we take, the signal to say inhale comes from the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the medulla is involved in every single breath you take. The medulla oblongata has three general groups of nuclei, so three different types of nuclei or cell masses that are present. There are autonomic nuclei that control visceral activities in the body, right? So autonomic nuclei that control our different organs and what those organs do. There are sensory and motor nuclei that are associated with multiple cranial nerves. So there are nuclei, there are neurons that send the nerves out to connect with cranial nerve 8, cranial nerve 9, cranial nerve 10, 11, and 12. Remember, the cranial nerves before this were from the pons, right? So like 5, 6, 7, those were all cranial nerves that come from the pons. So the cranial nerves that come from the medulla oblongata are 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. These are associated in controlling the muscles of the pharynx. So it would be important in swallowing, the neck and back. So you could see important in posture. These cranial nerves control some visceral activities, so like organ activities in the peritoneal cavity. Etc. Finally, so the nuclei, there are autonomic nuclei. There are nuclei that are associated with cranial nerves 8 through 12, and then there are just relay stations, right? We said that things going up into the brain go through the medulla oblongata, and signals that are going down the spinal cord have to go through the medulla oblongata. So a lot of the nuclei that are present are just relay stations. They just have signals that are coming through and they shoot them up or they shoot them back down. Okay, so we're going to talk through the medulla oblongata in more detail. We'll talk through more specific details about the nuclei. So we'll start with the autonomic nuclei, right? These are automatic functions we need for life. The medulla oblongata has cardiac centers, vasomotor centers, respiratory centers, and then some centers that control kind of general reflexes. The cardiac centers control the heart, right? So the cardiac centers have neurons that send signals to the heart. And they control, so the medulla oblongata controls the heart rate. That's how fast your heart beats. And the strength of contraction. How hard is your heart actually pumping? The vasomotor center sends signals to blood vessels. And that controls vessel diameter, so how big the blood vessel is. This vasomotor center tells blood vessels to constrict, to get smaller, or to dilate and get bigger. And that ends up controlling blood pressure. The medulla oblongata, we said, has the respiratory rhythmicity center. And this center sets the basic pace for respiratory movements. So the basic pace for breathing, right? How many times you breathe every minute. Finally, there are multiple reflex centers that include or control vomiting, and coughing and hiccuping, swallowing, and sneezing. All right, so we have progressed all the way down the brain stem. I'm going to go ahead and change the cerebellum. I'm going to push forward to the next lecture. I'm going to put that on part 3 because we've already gotten to our time limit for this class. So we'll go ahead and stop here. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to either email me or comment, and I'll get back to you guys as soon as possible. And then I'll see you in a couple days for part 3. Stay well. I hope you guys are all staying healthy and happy and not losing your minds while we're all stuck in our houses right now.